Welcome to Jewish Life, a program presented in cooperation with the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. I'm your host, Stuart Ain. Every week we present programs of particular interest to the Jewish community. Today we have a real treat. This is a program today we're going to talk about the Ritchie Boys, a little known group, and actually was not known at all until pretty recently. These were really heroes of World War II. Most of them were Jewish, and we have the daughters of two of the Ritchie Boys with us. Linda Kass, she is a writer, and she is also the author of A Ritchie Boy and Tasa's Song. And also joining us is Lanie Bergman, and she spent 20 years in municipal and nonprofit finance, including a stint as the controller of North Miami Beach, Florida. And her dad, also a Ritchie Boy, and she has some letters she's going to tell us about. So welcome both of you to the program. Why, when I said heroes, can you tell me, well, first of all, you know what, why don't we ask, why was it kept a secret until relatively recently? Linda, do you know why it was kept a secret?
Well, this was a secret organization. The Ritchie Boys, were military intelligence officers during World War II. And only in 1990s was the information declassified. So information started to come out, and mostly those of us who were related to Ritchie Boys, as Lanie and I were, we were well aware of what these heroes did for us in World War II, but most of the world was not.
And I say the heroes, Lanie, can you tell me why we should think of them as heroes?
Reading over my father's letters, when you're a child, your parents are older than dirt. But when I was working on my father's letters, my father came to the United States not quite 14 years old, okay?
Somewhere.
Not quite 19 years old. He's enlisted in the army, sent to work with the Ritchie Boys, and finds himself back in Europe on the strength of the fact that he's a native German speaker and grew up in Germany, so he knows the culture, the language, and I can't even imagine what it was like for him to go back to Germany.
What year did he go back?
He was there, and he started there in 1943, and he writes because his parents are constantly writing him letters. Can you look after the war is over? Can you look up this one? Can you look up that one? And of course, they're all gone.
Right, and his parents were able to get out.
Yeah, the story is that my grandparents were stateless because my great grandfather was an Ottoman subject, which is like a whole story, but they were stateless. They had Nansen passports, and they had tourist visas to come to the United States because they had been in the States for a cousin's wedding. So when the Germans walked into their store, they walked out the back, went to the accountant, and my grandfather said, "I didn't do anything wrong. I'll bring them my papers. I'll show them my accounts. They'll say, I'll go home." And the accountant said, "Mr. Bergman, no Jew walks out of the police station." So he gave my grandfather, all his cash and took my grandfather's bank books. And my grandparents got on a plane and they went to Rotterdam and they sold all my grandmother's jewelry and they took a boat to America. My grandmother says my grandfather, when the tugboat pulled away, said, it's a good thing I can't go back because I would. And once they got to the States, the Joint Distribution Committee helped them become immigrants, sent them to Havana. They came back as immigrants. And then my grandmother had cousins who were Americans who worked for the State Department. One worked for the State Department, and he helped with the family reunification because my father and my aunt, who were like 13 and 9, were staying temporarily with my grandmother's sister and brother-in-law. And the two of them, I mean, there again, you talk about crazy. Here's a 13-and-a-half-year-old and a 9-year-old coming across the Atlantic alone on the Queen Mary, right? They came to America in May 1937.
Right, but now at the age of 40, and rather 1943, when he was 19, he gets enlisted in the military. Did he enlist or did he get recruited? Did he
kept trying to enlist, and they wouldn't let him because at that time they wouldn't take anybody who was an alien. He wasn't a citizen at that point. Then when they realized how valuable these immigrants could be to them, then he was I don't know, enrolled, I don't know, drafted isn't really the right word, but he was allowed to join the military.
9,000 of these Ritchie boys.
Yeah.
Most of them Jewish, and I'm told that IQ was off the charts.
Well, in order to, and Linda could talk about this too, you had to be bilingual, at least. My father was certified in 3 languages in addition to English. So you had to pass all of the normal intelligence tests to be part of the intelligence service. So it wasn't an automatic thing that just because you were a German speaker that you were going to be allowed to be part of it.
Linda, how did your father came over in what year? And where did he come from?
So, these stories begin to sound quite similar because my father was 15 years old. He was born in Vienna, Austria, obviously spoke German in Austria. And he and his parents, he was an only child, he and his parents were very, very lucky to escape in 1938, immediately after the Anschluss, thanks to a benevolent individual in the United States who sponsored them, sight unseen, didn't know them, and got their affidavits. And that's a whole nother story. And these kinds of elements of truth are sort of things that I fictionalized in my novel. I took these true elements that did happen, and not being there created really full scenes and people who were very much sort of along the lines of what my father had experienced. But meanwhile, he came in 1938 at 15, so similar to Lanie's father. At 20, he was back in the theater of war. And you asked sort of how they would feel, or, and many were certainly motivated because here they had been persecuted. And going back to the theater of war, while I'm sure there was ambivalence involved, there also was a motivation to get those who had harmed them. And my father was in college paying for his way through Ohio State University, had finished 3 years at the point in which he was drafted. And actually he didn't find himself in Camp Ritchie, which is how these soldiers got their nicknames, Ritchie Boys. They, just to kind of give you a little context here, in about the summer of 1942, the U.S. Army centralized its intelligence operations at Camp Ritchie because it was this wonderful remote location in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was about 17 miles from Hagerstown, Maryland, and about 70 miles from Washington, D.C. And this was originally, it was originally founded by the Maryland National Guard, actually. It became the Army's secret intelligence training facility. So these individuals, my father was actually first in the mountain division in Colorado, since he came from Austria and he was a skier. But once they realized his fluency with German language, he was then sent to Camp Ritchie. So that's how that happened.
But Linda, you're completely right about the motivation. In fact, when my father was going down to the draft board every week and saying, please, please, he kept saying, I want to get into the Army before the war in Europe is over. I have nothing against the Japanese. I want to be, and one of the early letters he wrote from Camp Ritchie was he was a little disappointed because he kind of hoped to be in a combat unit. But then he realized that what he was going to be doing was in fact much more valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because so they didn't really, I guess they learned the basics about how to handle a gun, but their training was interrogation, investigation, psychological warfare. I mean, how long did it take to go through that training?
Well, they did do basic training also. They had to go through the same basic training.
Yeah. But this extra, how long did they do training in the States before they were able to ship off?
My understanding is the training at Camp Ritchie was really 3 months to 6 months. I think that was at the far end was 6 months, but three months generally, 3 to 4 months.
Wow. So they went over there and they would go with the regular troops and then they would split off. Is that right?
They were assigned different
Units.
Units, right. 6-member units. I know my father was at one point described to me being assigned right outside of Paris, right after what we now know as the Battle of the Bulge. Now, Battle of the Bulge got its name later. So back in those days, it was known as the Ardennes counteroffensive. And the Germans were literally, they were trying to escape into Paris and they were putting on other dead soldiers' uniforms so they could be disguised. And, at that point, the Ritchie Boys were trying to finger the imposters and bring them and interrogate them. And he was in a suburb, in a villa, in a suburb called Le Visinay. That he shared with me, so they were all over, and he later went to Germany. So they were all over the European front there.
Yeah, my father was assigned to Patton's Third Army, and in fact participated peripherally in the battle in the Battle of the Bulge, but they were assigned to different units, and then they were, I guess now we could say, embedded with these units, and they would follow them along, and they would do what there was, at first they were doing surveillance and intelligence, and then later on they started doing interrogation.
Right.
And another thing that they analyzed maps and documents and tried to identify bunkers and all kinds of German warfare. So they were bringing back information, and even from those interrogations, they were helping to identify locations of the enemy. So all that language was obviously key.
Tell me about this. Lanie, you mentioned that your father ended up interrogating a young man who he had gone to school with. Is that right?
Yes, I have the letter. Yesterday, I had a prisoner who used to sit on the same school bench with me for 3 years. When I heard where he went to school and I recognized him, I led him on a while and told him about himself and the school until he almost dropped dead with surprise. When I told him who I was, he suddenly remembered me and said, Naturlich, der Kümmeltürke, bloody, which means bloody Turk. My dad, because my father papers when he came to America show, born in Berlin, but ethnicity was Turk because they had because of these things. So he was one of the boys who was not a Nazi, and his parents had a clothing store on Friedrich St and Leipsiger. Remember, I think the name of the store was Bulmann or something like that. It was certainly funny to see my old classmate as a German officer.
And he said he's not an officer, right?
No, the classmate.
Oh,
the guy that the prisoner was an officer.
But he admitted it?
Yeah, there was no way not to admit it. No, the other story was that I told you was that after the Germans surrendered, my father was part of a patrol that was arresting former Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
And they went to this fellow's house, they knocked on the door, and they identified him, and then they said, we've come to arrest you because you were a Nazi. And he said, I'm not a Nazi. And they said, well, you used to be a Nazi. He said, yes, I was a Nazi. They said, well, when did you stop being a Nazi? He said, the day you guys arrived. So
but how much of an effort was there really to arrest Nazis? There really was not much. Was there much of an effort to arrest Nazis, or only just high-ranking Nazis?
Well, I think that I may be wrong about whether this was after the war was over, whether they were trying to get a hold of him because he was he had information for them. I don't think the Ritchie Boys were involved in Himmler, these big guys, although apparently one of them, there's a photograph on the Ritchie Boys website about one of them interrogating a fairly high-ranking officer, but that wasn't their main job.
Right. And counterintelligence was a big thing, right?
Counterintelligence was a very big thing. In fact, my daughter just reminded me that my dad and his group were staying in a villa, and he was captured. And the guy who was supposed to take him out to get shot, my father kept talking to him, and that led him to believe that my father was a double agent. So the guy shot in the air, my father ran off. So that and the classmate were the two stories that we heard growing up.
Lindy, do you think that there may be now a major motion picture? Maybe you'll write the major motion picture about the Ritchie Boys. I think that'd be a wonderful movie, no?
Yes, it certainly would be. I know that the gentleman who was on the 60 Minutes documentary that was recently aired, he was a historian from West Point, and apparently his name's David Fry, and he's involved in what is called the Ritchie Boy Project. And I believe he is really the catalyst for this renewed or new awareness of the Ritchie Boys. And part of the mission of his project is to gain the recognition that these brave, courageous soldiers so long did not have. And I even think in the description of his project, he talks about a major feature film. So, and I will say I've been called, but those kinds of things.
There's an hour and 15-minute documentary on YouTube. I sent you the link, Stuart.
Right.
And one of the people that was interviewed on that 60 Minutes thing has a long much more elaborate story about how he and a friend of his used to dress up. One of them is a Russian soldier, and because the Germans were petrified of being taken over by captured by the Russians, and how they used to really basically good cop, bad cop, interrogating them. There's a short version of that on the 60-minute thing, but there's a much longer version on this other thing. And the two of them are giggling and chortling along. I mean, you see these two 90-year-old guys and they're laughing like they're 20.
Yeah, the documentary. Yeah, the documentary actually was, there's kind of an interesting story that got my interest in even, pursuing this. So I'm a first generation American. My mother is from Eastern Poland and actually didn't come to this country until after the war, which is a whole different story. But because of my background as a journalist and my desire to have a sense of my parents and their lives and have that for posterity, I interviewed both of my parents on audio tape back when I was in my late 20s. And so that I kind of had this information about them. And, I discovered a whole lot of different things. And I knew my dad was in military intelligence, and I knew he was at Camp Ritchie, but I never knew there was a name for that. And it wasn't until about somewhere around 2013 or so that I was in his apartment and he put a letter on my lap and said, "Look what I got." And I look at this letter and it said, "Dear Ritchie Boy." And I said, "Dad, what is Dear Ritchie Boy? What is this?" And he says, "Well, I told you I trained at Camp Ritchie. That's what we were called." And so at that point, the journalist in me left and started, doing research. And I came upon the documentary Lanie's talking about. It was produced in 2004. And actually, I thought two of the three gentlemen on the 60 Minutes piece were in that documentary. Obviously, they were much younger. And it was very involved. And it really was my first introduction into what this Camp Ritchie was all about, what this meant. And so from there, I started doing much more research. My father and I actually watched the documentary together, which was really something. And he verified, yes, everything that they're sharing, this is what I went through. And pardon me?
You were lucky to be able to do that. My father died in 1980. So that was before, in 81. So he died before all of this stuff came out.
Yeah. Did you did you see your father in the documentary at all?
Oh, no, my dad was not in that documentary. They featured three men, and actually there were more than three. And once my novel came out, I got a lot of people kind of started writing me who had some relative who had been a Ritchie boy. I know there was a man from the East Coast somewhere whose father actually was an instructor in the Italian section at Camp Ritchie. And another man contacted me from Cleveland, and his uncle was a Ritchie boy, and his uncle was in the documentary. So these people, they're all over, and yet it had been so quiet because it just wasn't known.
Are many Ritchie boys still alive today?
There are very few. I mean, when you saw the 60 Minutes piece, the three featured men were 97, 98, and 99. So, that's a reason why this kind of information really must be preserved. I've always felt, my own family history, these individuals were witnesses to an important piece of our history, and it's precious, and we need to, keep that. And that way other people can be witnesses. So that's really what inspired me to write both of my books, actually. Both were inspired by family history.
Right. So Lana, you actually transcribed all the letters you had from.
Yes, I'm the family historian, right? So it's like, I don't want this junk, give it to Lanie, right? So when my grandmother died, she had saved all of his letters home, and they were sitting there, in a folder. And I guess after I retired, I had some time. So I started reading through them, and I said, it isn't fair for me to be the only one who has these. So I started to transcribe them, because some of them are typed, but most of them are in my father's handwriting, because he had learned to write in the German script, right? So it's a little, you have to already know sort of what he's saying. And so I really started out just doing it as a project for my sisters and my cousins and my nieces and nephews. And I was there's a Facebook page for the Ritchie Boys, and his guy who runs that page became interested in what I was doing. I sent him a lot of the photographs I have. So I started interspersing photographs. I started interspersing historical context. I don't know if I'm as ambitious as Linda to actually publish it for more than just my family, but I think partially because my dad died so early and didn't know any of his grandchildren, it was very important to me to do that. Plus, once I started reading them, I can't even explain it to you. He writes in his own voice. When I read these letters, I hear my father's voice. And so it was important, as Linda says, these are things that even not only is that generation almost gone, but even our generation, I'm 73, right? So even the second, we call ourselves like the second generation, right? Holocaust survivors.
Yeah.
We're getting old now, So there are a lot of people who, when I grew up, everybody I knew had at least one foreign-born parent. And now that was not at all the experience that my children had growing up. So it's important. This stuff is very important, and not just the history stuff, but the personal stuff that comes out.
Thank you very much. This has been really a fast half hour. Let me thank you again, both Lanie Bergman and Linda Kass, for joining us and telling us about the Ritchie Boys and about your dads, and really fascinating story. And I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. This has been Jewish Life. Until next week, I'm Stuart Aim. Thanks for watching.